Today's topic will be the halacha of the obligation to move to Eretz Yisrael to make aliyah, whether it applies nowadays, and possibly what's the heter. I live in Queens, New York, so what's the heter that a lot of very fine Rabbanim, not myself, but many big Rabbanim, Ramesha Feinstein and Lubavitch Rebbe, and a lot of big Rabbanim of recently, and all the Rabbanim outside of Chutz La'aretz historically, what exactly were they relying upon that they lived outside of Eretz Yisrael? So the Ramban writes in Mitzvah Say Dalid. The Ramban, in his Pirush on Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam, he adds certain mitzvahs that the Rambam omitted. So in the Mitzvah Say Dalid, he adds that although the Rambam did not count the obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael, to move to Eretz Yisrael, the Ramban says, no, there is a mitzvah. He says over here, there's a mitzvah upon every Jew to move to Eretz Yisrael, to live, to inhabit the land that was given to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and chas v'shalom, not to let the non-Jewish people take over the country. So there's a mitzvah on each person. And he continues to say that don't tell me that the obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael is not really to live nowadays. It was only to conquer the 7 umos that was obligated for Yeshua when he entered Eretz Yisrael to conquer the land at that one time. He says that's not true because there's a mitzvah to this day. Every person has an obligation, even if hypothetically all the 7 umais were to leave Eretz Yisrael, and he says move to a beautiful land like Africa, we would still be obligated to live in Eretz Yisrael. He quotes over there that a Sifri is a very interesting Sifri. There are Yehuda ben Beseira and Ramasya ben Cherish and Chananya ben Achi and Rav Yeshua and Rav Nassan were all leaving Eretz Yisrael. And as they left Eretz Yisrael, they looked back on the land of Israel and they started to cry. And they ripped their clothing. And they said, and then they felt terrible because they were leaving the land of Israel, and they went back. So says the Ramban, we see from here, they obviously lived after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and we see from here that there's an obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael to this day. That's why they, as they left, they cried and they went back. That's the Ramban says. The Rashbash in Siman Beis quotes this Ramban, and he says that his father, the Tashbeitz, in Sefer Zayriki, also held that there was a mitzvah Minute Torah to live in Eretz Yisrael to this day. So that's the opinion of the Ramban and the Tashbeitz. However, as we mentioned before, the Rambam did not count this as a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. So the Megillas Esther on the Sefer HaMitzvahs writes, V'nira ki ma sheleimana harav hu lefisha mitzvahs Yerushas ha'eretz v'yishivasa le'naga rak b'mimoshe v'Yeshua v'David. V'chol zman sheleigolu me'artzam avar achar shegolu me'al admasam ein mitzvah zuna hegetz l'deiros ad eis ba HaMashiach. Says the Megillah Esther, the reason why the Rambam did not count it is because the Rambam feels that after the Churban there is no obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. The mitzvah was only applied when Klal Yisrael was in charge during the times of Moshe, Yeshua, and David, but after the Churban there's no longer an obligation to move to Eretz Yisrael and to live in Eretz Yisrael. That's the, according to the Megillah Esther, that's the explanation of the Rambam. And it seems that according to the Megillah Esther, there's neither a biblical obligation nor a rabbinic obligation. There's nothing. Ramesha Feinstein in Yardei Chel Gimel Siman Kuf Chav Beis explains that if you feel that there's no biblical obligation, meaning if you feel that there was no mitzvah Minat Torah after the Churban, then there would be no reason for the Rabbanon to create a rabbinic obligation. Meaning that if you feel that it's not biblical, then after the Churban, according to the Rambam, as explained by the Megillah Esther, there's no longer a biblical obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. So then Moshe says, it's not like the Rabbanon would create a rabbinic one, because the Rabbanon would not create a mitzvah that would be very difficult to keep. After the Churban, it was very, very difficult to move to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore, according to the Megillah Esther, basically, and perhaps according to Moshe, in the understanding of Megillah Esther, and the understanding of the Rambam, there's neither a biblical nor a rabbinic obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. Other Mefarshim question the Megillah Esther because the Rambam does count mitzvahs that seemingly don't apply after the Churban, but that's the opinion of the Megillah Esther. However, the Rashbash in Siman Beis continues and he quotes the Rambam, And he says, even though the Rambam does not count this as a mitzvah min Torah, however, it's a rabbinic mitzvah. Meaning, so the Megillah Esther feels that according to the Rambam, there's no obligation at all. But according to the Rashbash, there is a rabbinic obligation according to the Rambam. Now, I don't believe that that's in disagreement with Rav Moshe. I think he's just saying that according to the Rambam, perhaps it was always rabbinic. Rav Moshe was just saying that if you felt that it was biblical until the Churban, but after the Churban there was no more mitzvah, there's no reason for the Rabbanan to institute it then. But it's possible that it was originally a rabbinic obligation. That's the opinion of the Rashbash. And there is also the Avnei Nezer. Avnei Nezer explains the Rambam has really feeling that it's biblical, but he didn't count it for... basically, there are many rules as to what goes into the 613, the count of the 613. Some things make it into the count of the 613, some things don't make it into the count of the 613. So the Avnei Nezer explains that even though the Rambam did not count it as part of the 613 mitzvahs, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not biblical. There are many, many rules. The Rambam wrote many, many shroshim to explain what makes it to the count of the 613. Just because it's not there doesn't mean it's not biblical. Rav Kook is quoted by the Tzitz Eliezer as also understanding that it's biblical according to the Rambam. So, to summarize so far, we have the Ramban and the Tashbetz who feels that it's a biblical obligation to this day. You have the Rambam who omits it. So, according to the Megillah Esther, according to the Rambam, there's no mitzvah at all. According to the Avnei Nezer, the Rambam also agrees that it's biblical, and according to the Rashbash, the Rambam feels that it's rabbinic. So, there's a Taisus in Ksubis. The Taisus in Ksubis, Daf Kof Yudam Beis, quotes Rav Chaim Cohen, Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen. Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, one of the Rishonim, he says, Achshav einay mitzvah lodur b'Eretz Yisrael. He says, the Rav Chaim HaKohen says that today there is no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. Ki yesh kama mitzvahs hatuliyos ba'aretz v'kama oinshin de'ein ani yochel lihizar behem v'lamed aleim, because there are many mitzvahs that only apply to Eretz Yisrael, like Trumas and Meisers and Shvius, and because it's very difficult to keep these laws, therefore there's no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. According to Rav Moshe Feinstein, and the basic understanding of this Tosfos is that because it's so difficult to keep the mitzvahs to live in Israel, therefore there's no longer a mitzvah to live in Israel at all. Meaning, according to Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, the reason to live in Israel is not because it's a holy land. The whole obligation to live in Israel was in order to keep the laws. That's a big chiddush. Some people debate that. The Mabit might have disagreed with that, but according to Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, the whole reason to live in Eretz Yisrael is not because it's a holy land, not in order to daven. It's that Hashem obligated us to live in Israel in order so that we can fulfill the mitzvahs of Trumas and Meiser. So says Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, today, when it's too difficult to keep it, the obligation no longer exists. That's the basic understanding of Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen. There are those who disagree with that understanding. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had a different opinion. He parenthetically, he actually said that nowadays it's not so hard to keep it, so maybe Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen would agree that nowadays there is a mitzvah to live in Israel. But the point is, according to Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, whatever his understanding, however you understand the lumdus behind it, but according to Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, there's no longer a mitzvah to live in Israel because it's too difficult to keep the obligations. The Noda B'Yehuda in Yeridea, Madur Tinyana Simon Reish Vav quotes from his son that would explain why all the Bali Atososim lived outside of Israel. Right? Bali Atososim, they all lived outside of Israel. Why didn't any of them move? You have so many Gaonim, so many Rabbanim, none of them moved to Israel. The answer is because they were all Somich on Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, that there's no longer a mitzvah to live in Israel because it's too difficult to keep the mitzvahs. Now, as I said before, some poskim disagree with Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen. The Marit in Chelik Beis Yordei Simichav Ches writes that if you feel that the obligation to live in Israel is not because it has nothing to do with the mitzvahs of Israel, it has to do with the holiness of the land, then one can argue that there's no reason to differentiate between today and yesteryear where it was easier. In either case, it shouldn't make a difference. The Chidah and Yosef Holmutz also writes, and Simon Beis also writes that it's that the Chidah is a das yachid. But let's go back to what we're saying. Let's summarize quickly before we say the last final opinion. According to the Ramban and the Tashbetz, it's a biblical obligation. According to the Rambam, it's unclear. It could be that he feels that there's no obligation at all. It could be he feels that it's rabbinic. And according to Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, there's no obligation. Now, how do we paskin? So, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that most opinions feel that it is obligatory. Most opinions feel like the Ramban, that there's at least some sort of obligation. It might be rabbinic, it might be biblical, but most opinions feel that it is obligatory. So what's the deal? So how do we explain our actions? So Rav Moshe Feinstein writes in Even Ezer Siman Kuf Beis that the obligation to live in Israel, even if you feel that it is obligatory, like the Ramban, however, it's called the mitzvah kiyumis, not a mitzvah chiyuvis, meaning there are two different types of mitzvahs. I might go over 1 or 2 minutes, so please forgive me. There are two different types of mitzvahs. There's mitzvah chiyuvis and mitzvah kiyumis. There are mitzvahs that you have to do, like tefillin. You have to do it every day, no matter what. But then there are mitzvahs like kiyumis, which means you don't have to do it. But if you do it, you get a mitzvah, like tzedakah. You don't have to give tzedakah if you don't have money. You don't, it's not something that you have to do every day. You don't have to wear tzitzis. It's if you wear a 4-cornered beged, then you have to put tzitzis on it. But you don't have to wear tzitzis. If you don't wear tzitzis during the day, you just don't wear it. You didn't do anything wrong. But if you don't wear tefillin, you did do something wrong. So it says in Moshe Feinstein, the obligation to live in Israel, even if it is an obligation, it's a mitzvah kiyumis, meaning you don't have to. But if you do, then you get a mitzvah. So therefore it says in Moshe, because it's not obligatory in the classical sense, then one can take into account Rabbeinu Chaim HaKohen, that it's difficult to live in the land, it's difficult in order to fulfill the obligations, and perhaps other mitigating factors would come into play now that we know that it's not the classical obligation. Rav Shechter Shlita, in his Sefer Pnei Harav in the Hakdama, writes that Rav Soloveitchik felt the same way. Rav Soloveitchik also felt that it's a mitzvah kiyumis, but it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis, and therefore perhaps that will explain the actions of many people. Even if you feel that it is obligatory, it's not obligatory in the classical sense. I forgot to mention in the beginning, but please don't be samech on this lahalach l'maisa. You should ask a rav before any halachic question, especially something as monumentous as moving to Eretz Yisrael. Any questions could be sent to avizakatinsky@gmail.com, avizakutinsky@gmail.com.